Hello everyone, my name is Rachel. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am bringing you guys my mid-August wrap up, and unfortunately I have quite a few mediocre books to talk about today. Quite a few of the books that I've read so far this month were 3 stars, so they were just okay, and I think what I'm gonna do is work my way from the book that I liked the least to the book that I liked the most so far this month. So the first book I want to talk about, I got this arc off of NetGalley. A lot of these books will be arcs because it is arc August, so I am trying my best to read as many NetGalley arcs as possible. But the first one I want to talk about is When No One Is Watching by Alyssa Cole. This is Alyssa Cole's first thriller novel. She is primarily a romance author. Now, I haven't gotten the chance yet to read any of her romance novels, but I did get approved for her newest romance that's coming out later this fall, so I'm really looking forward to reading that. But yeah, this is a thriller that essentially centers around this neighborhood in Brooklyn. We have our main character Sydney, and another major character is Theo, who is someone who has recently moved into the neighborhood, and Sydney is noticing that all of the black people in her neighborhood are mysteriously moving out and white people are moving in, and the neighborhood, of course, is becoming very gentrified. So I really wanted to love this, but from the first page, the pacing was pretty slow the entire time, which is something that gets very tedious after a while. I mean, I will say that her writing style was interesting enough that I didn't DNF it, but it still was pretty tedious to get through. And you know, with thrillers, you want really good plot twists and things like that, and there were no like really shocking plot twists. All of them were like kind of mildly surprising. I just wasn't shocked by anything that happened in this book. And the villains of the story just ended up being these very stereotypical evil white people, and I just kind of wish that there would have been more complexity with those characters and with the plot in general. I don't know, so I was kind of disappointed in this. I did end up giving it 2.5 stars. That being said, if this subject interests you at all, I would still recommend checking it out because there were quite a few things that I learned about gentrification in general. There's just a lot of historical aspects that Sydney's character kind of brings into the story because she's kind of like an amateur historian, so she does a lot of research throughout this book, and so that makes things interesting. But yeah, I just unfortunately was not a huge fan of this. Next arc I want to discuss is A Secret Surrender. This is by Darcy Burke. This is book 1 in her newest series called The Pretenders. If you've been following me for a while, you would know that I really enjoyed her Spitfire Society series, so going into this book I expected to love it, and unfortunately that was not the case. I ended up giving this 3 stars. Literally everything from the premise to the characters to the romance was just okay. Just to give you a basic synopsis, this centers around Selena. She's pretending to be this fortune teller called Madame Sibylla. And then we have Harry, who's a Bow Street runner who is trying to uncover who this Madame Sibylla is and is trying to out her for the fraud that he thinks that she is. And then of course a romance develops between Harry and Selena. Basically the whole time Harry has no idea that Selena is really this fortune teller. And the only reason why I didn't give this less than 3 stars is that there was a surprisingly good plot twist at the end. Unfortunately, I wouldn't recommend this if you've never read anything from Darcy Burke before, because I feel like this book would kind of turn you off to her as an author. I would suggest just going into her Spitfire Society series. Next book I read was Me and White Supremacy: Combat Racism, Change the World, and Become a Better Ancestor by Layla F. Saad. This is kind of a self-help book in a lot of ways because this book takes you through like a 28-day journey, and of course this book is written for white people to kind of come to terms with their whiteness and their privilege, and you know, tackling really important topics about racism and things like that. I gave this 3 stars. To me, this was just okay. My main issue with this was, while Saad introduces a lot of really important topics such as optical allyship, tone policing, what white supremacy really means, things like that, she tends to really speed through these terms and these topics really quickly and doesn't give you enough time to really let them sink in and to really learn the information, if that makes sense. Because each chapter that would cover a specific term was only about like 2 to 3 pages. So I just feel like there wasn't enough substance to this book to really teach you. And what's also odd is that at the same time, I found this book to be very repetitive. And so while I was listening to this audiobook, I was listening to the audiobook and reading the physical book at the same time. I found myself zoning out because she was just saying the same things over and over, just worded slightly differently. And a lot of the things that she was talking about were also things that I've already learned from other books that cover these kind of topics. So unfortunately, I can't really recommend it. I just feel like there are countless other books that you will learn a lot more from, especially if you're a white person, such as White Fragility, White Rage. So you want to talk about race, although those books are also great for people of all races to read. The next book I want to discuss is You Had Me At Ola by Alexis Daria. I was so excited going into this book because it centers around Jasmine and Ashton. They are telenovela stars and they are both starting this really important project with a Netflix type production company, and it sounds like it's part soap opera, like part telenovela, but also just part TV drama. So it's a bit more of a serious show than like an over-the-top melodramatic telenovela, and they're going to end up playing each other's love interests because basically this show is about this woman Carmen, and she like runs this PR firm, and her ex-husband, who Ashton is playing, is one of her clients. And so that's kind of the premise of the show, and the premise of the book centers around the show, obviously. So I really enjoyed this for the most part. The overall plot was really good. I liked the characters, like all of the side characters. I also loved the incorporation of scenes from the actual show. So they would include pages of script kind of as they were filming certain scenes, and I thought that was interesting. Also, the smut was like chef's kiss. So good. Unfortunately, that's kind of where the pros end for me. I ended up giving this 3.5 stars, so I still overall enjoyed it. It wasn't a bad book by any means, but I just kind of noticed that by the second half of the book, the plot was kind of meandering, and I felt like the book just kind of lost steam a bit. So yeah, unfortunately, it's not a new favorite of mine or anything like that, but I am looking forward to reading more from Alexis Daria. You Had Me At Ola was an NetGalley arc, and then the next book I'm going to discuss was also a NetGalley arc, and that is A Dark and Stormy Night by Kerrigan Byrne. I think this is book 7 in her Victorian Rebels series, and this one centers around Carlton Morley, who is essentially a police officer that has been featured in all of the books leading up to this one. So I think a lot of us that love this series were really looking forward to getting his own book. But this book has a very interesting beginning because we have our other main character, Prudence, who is getting ready to get married to this man that she doesn't want to marry. So she decides for her last night of freedom to go out and hire a male prostitute at this brothel, but lo and behold, she ends up mistaking Morley for a male prostitute because he's investigating a crime having to do with the brothel. So he's like wearing a mask, he doesn't want to be recognized, but Prudence sees him and they immediately have this connection, and things end up getting really steamy between the two of them the very first night that they meet. And then we skip 3 months later. This book does feature like the secret baby trope because Prudence does become pregnant from their one night 3 months earlier. So if you don't like that trope, then definitely don't read this book, because I know a lot of people hate, you know, the surprise pregnancy trope. So just be aware of that. You know, overall this book was good but not great, and I do have to wonder if that's because this installment of the series is not being published under St. Martin's Press. It's kind of sounds like it's being self-published by Kerrigan Byrne or with a much smaller publisher, and so I have to wonder if that's the reason why this book to me wasn't as high of quality as the other books in this series that I've read. The romance between Morley and Prudence was just fine. I did find that my favorite part of the book was that first very steamy scene between the two of them, and then I did feel like the smut after that just felt very repetitive. It just felt like the same scene was playing over and over again. Overall, this book was good. It wasn't great, but I'm still looking forward to reading future books in this series because we've already been introduced to the characters that are going to have their own romances in future books, so that's always really exciting. So last but not least, I have a few books to talk about that I do own physical copies of. So this past weekend, there was the Historical Romance Weekend Readathon, and I got to read 3 really great books for that. I will link all of the information for that readathon down below. There were 3 hosts for it. It was Jess from Peace Love Books, Lacey from Lacey Book Lovers, and Lisa from Remarkably Lisa. They are some of my favorite romance booktubers. I feel like I've been talking about them a lot on my channel recently, but I also did a reading vlog for that readathon. I will link it up in the cards above. I posted that a few days ago, so I definitely recommend checking that out. I had such a fun time reading these romances, so I thought I would just quickly talk about them. I'm not going to go too in depth because, like I said, I have a reading vlog where I discuss these books quite in depth. So the first one that I read was Scandalous Desires by Elizabeth Hoyt. This is book 3, I believe, in her Maiden Lane series. This whole series centers around this vigilante known as the Ghost of St. Giles, and because he's a mass vigilante, nobody really knows who the Ghost of St. Giles actually is, but I think it turns out that there are multiple men that are the Ghost of St. Giles. And so I think that this series is all about this group of men and their different romances and things like that. So this one was actually a pirate romance about Mickey O'Connor and Silence Hollingbrooke, and it's kind of a second chance romance because they definitely have kind of a messy past with one another. Basically, the year before this book starts, Mickey had Silence spend the night with him at his house, but nothing happened, but he wanted to make it look like something happened. And so unfortunately, Silence's husband then kind of distanced himself from her, and then he ended up dying shortly after, so she is a widow now, and she's also been taking care of Mickey's 2-year-old daughter. Now Mickey's rival, who is known as the Vicar, he's just this really evil man who is known as the Vicar for some reason, he has essentially threatened Silence and his daughter's life, and so he makes them come live with him in his house. So it's a forced proximity romance. I really enjoyed this. I loved the balance between the romance and the action and adventure scenes and things like that. Then after that, I read It Happened One Autumn by Lisa Kleypas. This is book 2 in the Wallflower series. This one essentially centers around Lillian. She is an American heiress, and Marcus, who is Lord Westcliff, and they have like very polar opposite personalities. He's much more like serious and reserved. She's much more outgoing, very stubborn, very fierce, and it's their kind of enemies to lovers romance, but I enjoyed this a lot. I gave this 4 stars, thought that it was so much better than book 1 of this series, which is Secrets of a Summer Night. And then the last book that I read for the readathon was The Madness of Lord Ian Mackenzie by Jennifer Ashley. I gave this 5 stars. This is a book that is highly, highly hyped in the romance community, and for very good reason. We are essentially centering around Ian Mackenzie, who he essentially has autism spectrum disorder, but this takes place in the 1880s, so they didn't have that terminology. They didn't know what autism was. They didn't really have much knowledge about mental illnesses or disorders or anything like that. So anybody who was deemed abnormal was just thrown into insane asylums, unfortunately, and so he spent most of his life in an asylum, and so now he finds it very hard to trust people, but he ends up meeting this woman, Beth, who is also a recent widow, and a romance quickly ensues between the two of them. And there's also a really cool murder mystery element to this book. So yeah, I enjoyed this a lot. This is also book 1 of like the Mackenzie Clan series by Jennifer Ashley, so I'm definitely looking forward to reading more books in this series. So again, like I said, if you want to hear more of my in-depth thoughts about those books, you can either check out my Goodreads reviews of them or check out that reading vlog like I talked about in a couple minutes ago. Then the very last book I want to discuss is Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. And wow, this book is straight up a masterpiece. This is like a 600-page textbook, essentially. It's an amazing historical resource that chronicles all the way from essentially the beginning of human civilization all the way to present day in the United States. This does primarily just cover the United States, although every now and then he'll mention what's going on in Europe and things like that for context, but this is definitely an American history textbook, and I thought it was absolutely phenomenal. The amount of things that I learned from this book, just makes it absolutely invaluable, and I cannot recommend it enough for people of all races in this country to read. Also, I wanted to point out that there is a YA version of this book because obviously this is a very dense adult textbook. So Ibram X. Kendi actually collaborated with Jason Reynolds to write a YA version just called Stamped, and I highly recommend checking that out as well if you're a younger reader or you're just not ready to commit to this giant textbook. I'm sure that that book is just as amazing as this one, but yeah, I cannot recommend it highly enough. Alright guys, that's going to be it for my mid-August reading wrap-up. I would love it if you would leave a comment down below if you want to discuss any of the books that I talked about in this video, and I would also love it if you would leave a like and subscribe, and I thank you in advance if you do. And with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!